In the suffocating embrace of the Pacific's midnight blue, a research vessel named the Kronos plowed through the waves, miles away from any semblance of civilization. Its hull, a behemoth of steel, groaned under the relentless pressure of the deep sea as it carried its crew of 12 on a mission to explore the uncharted depths of the Mariana Trench. Dr. Eliza Grant, the lead marine biologist aboard, was fixated on her screens displaying the live feed from the submersible drone they had sent into the abyss. Beside her, Tom, the seasoned captain of the Kronos, watched with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. "Anything yet, Eliza?" Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper over the hum of the ship's engines and the crackle of static from the communication system. "Just the usual deep-sea critters," Eliza replied, her eyes never leaving the screen. Although the drone's approaching a particularly steep incline. The topography here isn't well mapped. As they watched, the drone's lights illuminated a peculiar rock formation that resembled a grotesque, gaping moor. Suddenly, a swift movement flickered at the edges of the light's reach, and then it was gone. "Did you see that?" Eliza leaned closer, tapping the screen. Before Tom could respond, a low, guttural moan echoed through the ship's hull, sending a shiver down their spines. The sound was otherworldly, mourning, and desperate. "It's probably just the hull," Tom said after a pause, though his voice lacked conviction. Eliza wasn't so sure. The drone continued its descent, and the water around it darkened, swallowing the beam of its lights almost whole. Another flicker of movement, this time closer, and an undulating shadow passed over the drone. The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, and Eliza could see her breath. "That's not normal," she muttered, her fingers poised over the keyboard. The communication system crackled to life. "Eliza, Tom, you need to see this," came the voice of Alex, the technician, from the lower deck. In the lab, Alex pointed to the thermographic monitor, which showed an inexplicable cold mass moving through the water near the drone. It was vast, much larger than any whale recorded, and it was moving unnaturally fast. "How is that possible?" Eliza's voice trembled. Tom placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his eyes glued to the screen. "Keep tracking it." Back in the control room, the drone's camera caught a clearer image of the shadow. It wasn't just one entity but many, swirling around each other in a frenzied dance. They seemed to be beckoning the drone closer. "Pull it back, Eliza," Tom said firmly. But before she could react, all lights on the drone flickered and went out, plunging the screen into pitch blackness. A screeching sound pierced their ears, coming from the communication system itself. Then silence. "It's lost," Eliza whispered, horror-struck. The crew gathered in the main cabin, tension and fear palpable in the air. They debated whether to retrieve the drone when a loud bang shook the vessel, knocking everyone off their feet. The lights flickered, threatening darkness. "Something's out there," one of the crew members said, peering out of the porthole. In the dim glow of the emergency lights, they saw it, a leviathan shadow against the ocean's abyssal pitch, circling the Kronos. Another bang, this time more forceful, sent a cracked spider webbing across the glass of the porthole. "We need to move," Tom declared, pulling himself up. "Now?" As the Kronos turned, attempting to escape the unseen terror, the ocean seemed to churn with anger, or perhaps excitement. The ship groaned and listed, water beginning to seep in through the new fractures. Eliza grabbed the satellite phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the distress code. Outside, the shadow converged with others, forming a massive, swirling entity. Their moans and screeches melded into a cacophony that drowned out even the roar of the ocean. The line connected, and Eliza shouted into the phone, "Mayday, Mayday, this is the Kronos." The ship lurched violently, cutting off her cry. As they braced for another impact, the crew felt an undeniable pull from below, drawing them toward the ocean's most secretive depths. And amid the chaos, a voice whispered through the static of the intercom, chilling and ancient, "Welcome home." In the oppressive gloom of the ocean's depths, the crew of the Kronos felt the weight of the sea pushing against the vessel's battered frame. Water trickled in through the fractures with a menacing hiss, each droplet a harbinger of the deep's icy embrace. The shadows outside swirled in a dance of madness, their movements synchronized with the rhythmic thumping against the ship's hull. Each blow was a drumbeat of doom, echoing through the steel corridors. "Secure everything," Captain Tom bellowed over the din of the creeping water and the ship's alarm, which wailed like a banshee calling them to their fates. The crew, a mixture of seasoned sailors and young researchers, scrambled to follow his orders, fear etching deep lines in their faces. Eliza, her heart pounding in her chest, managed to secure the satellite phone in a waterproof case. She clutched it like a lifeline, the only connection to a world beyond this aquatic nightmare. As she worked, her mind raced. How had a routine expedition turned into a struggle for survival against an unknown horror from the abyss? Amid the chaos, Alex approached her, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. "Did you hear it, Eliza?" The voice on the intercom, it spoke in English. "How is that possible?" "It doesn't matter," she replied, voice trembling. "We need to focus on getting out of here." But deep down, curiosity gnawed at her. The voice had been eerily calm, almost soothing, in stark contrast to the terror enveloping them. It was as if the ocean itself had spoken, welcoming them to a watery grave. As the Kronos struggled to navigate away from the entity, the temperature inside the vessel plummeted. Breath became visible, and frost formed on the interior surfaces. The crew donned their thermal gear, shivering not just from the cold but from the unshakable feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The only illumination came from the dim glow of emergency lighting, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe along the walls. The thumping grew louder, more insistent. "We're not going to outrun it," one of the crew yelled over the noise. Tom gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. "We have to try." Full speed ahead. The engines groaned under the strain as the Kronos picked up speed. For a moment, it seemed they might escape, but then a massive force struck the stern. The impact sent crew members flying, and screams filled the air as the reality of their situation set in. They were being hunted. In the engine room, water began to flood in rapidly through a widening crack. The ship listed dangerously to one side, and the lights flickered again, this time struggling to come back on. In the eerie semi-darkness, the crew fought to keep the ship afloat, but it was a losing battle against the relentless assault from the deep. Eliza and Alex found themselves in the research lab, trying to salvage any data they could. The screens flickered with static, occasionally showing the swirling mass of shadows outside. "Look at this," Alex said, pointing to a thermal imaging screen. The mass appeared not just as a cold spot, but as a void, absence of any detectable heat, an impossibility in the known natural world. "It's like it's absorbing energy directly from its surroundings," Eliza muttered, her scientific mind racing. "It's not just physical. It might be paranormal." Alex finished for her, his voice a whisper. Before she could respond, the ship shook violently again. The sound of twisting metal was deafening as water burst into the lab. Equipment and papers floated around them in the icy water that quickly rose to their knees. "We need to abandon ship," Eliza shouted, grabbing Alex's arm. They made their way to the deck, where lifeboats were being prepared. The ocean roared around them, a beast in the throes of rage. As they looked back at the mass surrounding the ship, it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, shadows moving within it like the beating of a dark heart. "Let's go, now." Tom's voice cut through the turmoil as he ushered the crew into the lifeboats. But as the first lifeboat hit the water, a tentacle-like appendage shot out from the mass, wrapping around it with terrifying speed. The screams of the crew were cut short as the lifeboat was dragged under, swallowed by the ocean. The remaining crew watched in horror, frozen by the sight of their colleagues' demise. Eliza's mind reeled. How could they survive this? What was this creature, or creatures, that defied all known laws of nature and physics? As the chronos sank lower, the water continued to rise relentlessly, claiming more of the ship with each passing moment. The crew, now aware of the dire nature of their predicament, rushed to deploy the remaining lifeboats. Their movements were frantic, fueled by adrenaline and the primal urge to survive. Keep moving, everyone stick together. Captain Tom commanded, his voice carrying over the roar of the ocean. As they worked, the massive entity that circled them seemed to pulse with a malicious intent, its form occasionally illuminated by the lightning that now tore through the sky above. Eliza, her hands numb from the cold, helped the younger crew members into the next lifeboat. She couldn't help but glance back at the churning waters, half expecting to see the tentacle-like appendages emerge again. Her heart raced, each beat a loud drum in her ears, echoing the ominous thuds against the hull. "We're almost ready," shouted Alex, securing the safety ropes of the second lifeboat. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror but determined. As they lowered the lifeboat into the raging sea, a loud crack resonated through the air. The crew froze, turning their heads just in time to see the stern of the Chronos begin to split, a dark gaping maw opening up as the ship itself seemed to scream in agony. The sight was petrifying, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. The rain, the wind, even the monstrous entity seemed to hold its breath. Then chaos erupted. The ship lurched violently, throwing several crew members to the ground. Water surged into the newly formed breach, and the ocean's icy fingers pulled relentlessly at everything within reach. "We need to jump," Tom yelled, cutting through the panic with his commanding tone. "Now? It's our only chance." Without waiting, he leaped into the lifeboat, followed closely by Alex and the others. Eliza took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage she had, before jumping. The cold hit her like a wall, her breath stolen by the shock of the freezing water. The lifeboat bobbed precariously on the turbulent waves, each crest threatening to send them tumbling into the abyss below. They paddled desperately away from the Chronos, which now sat partially submerged, a sad remnant of the vessel that had been their home and sanctuary. As they moved away, the water around the sinking ship began to swirl ominously, forming a whirlpool that threatened to drag everything down with it. The entity, ever present, seemed to hover at the edge of the whirlpool, its form more defined now in the chaos. It was a mass of writhing shadows, each one twisting and turning in a grotesque dance. Eyes, if they could be called that, glimmered within the mass, fixating on the lifeboat with a hunger that was palpable. The wind howled around them, carrying with it voices, whispers that were almost drowned out by the storm. They were indistinct, yet they carried a message that chilled Eliza to her core. "Join us," they seemed to say, a chorus of the damned calling them to the depths. Lightning cracked the sky again, illuminating the horror in stark relief. The entity moved closer, its size daunting, a nightmare come to life. It was as if the sea had conjured a monster from the darkest corners of human fear, ancient, powerful, and inexorable. "Row faster." Tom's voice broke through Eliza's frozen horror. The crew, motivated by sheer terror, obeyed, pushing their strained muscles to the limit. Eliza glanced back at the sinking Chronos, her mind a whirl of despair and disbelief. How could they possibly survive this? The thought was cut short as the lifeboat was suddenly lifted by an enormous wave. For a moment, they were suspended in midair, the world a blur of storm and spray. Then, as if the sea itself had thrown them in defiance of the dark entity, the lifeboat crashed back down onto the ocean surface. Water splashed everywhere, soaking them to the bone, but miraculously, the boat held together. They were far from safe, however. The entity seemed to grow agitated, its movements more frantic as it realized its prey was escaping. Another appendage shot out from the mass, this time larger and faster. "It's coming again," one of the crew screamed, pointing towards the looming shadow. Eliza turned just in time to see the dark tendril racing towards them, water churning violently in its wake. She braced herself, closing her eyes against the impending doom. But the impact never came. Instead, a bright light pierced the darkness, cutting through the storm like a blade. It was so intense, so unexpected, that everyone shielded their eyes. The light seemed to strike directly at the entity, which recoiled as if in pain, its form dissolving slightly at the edges. "What is that?" Alex gasped, squinting through the blinding light. "I don't know, but it's saving us," shouted another crew member, relief mingled with confusion in his voice. The light, originating from an unknown source above the storm, seemed to focus on the monstrous entity, which writhed and screamed in what could only be described as agony. The sound was otherworldly, a mix of thunder and the wails of countless souls, echoing across the turbulent waters and piercing through the howl of the wind. As the crew watched, mesmerized and terrified, the entity began to dissolve, its form becoming unstable, like ink dispersing in water. However, the respite was short-lived. From the depths below, new forms began to emerge, smaller but just as sinister. They swarmed towards the light, as if trying to extinguish it. "Keep rowing," Captain Tom ordered, seizing the momentary distraction to increase their distance from the chaos behind them. The crew resumed their frantic efforts, paddling with renewed vigor, driven by the hope that the mysterious light was a sign of potential rescue. The storm continued to rage around them, the ocean a beast in turmoil, but the light remained constant, a beacon in the night. Eliza, her mind racing, tried to make sense of what was happening. Who or what could control such powerful light, and why intervene now? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in the wind. The air grew colder, if that was even possible, and a dense fog began to roll in from all directions, enveloping their lifeboat in a thick, suffocating blanket. Visibility dropped to nearly zero, and the light above dimmed, obscured by the heavy mist. Where did the fog come from? Alex asked, his voice low and tense. "It's not natural," Eliza replied, her voice barely a whisper. She knew the ocean well, and this fog was unlike anything she had experienced. It felt alive, malicious, as if it were trying to smother them in its cold embrace. The whispers returned, louder now, carried on the fog. "Join us," they beckoned, a chorus of voices that were neither male nor female, old nor young. "Become one with the depths." Eliza shivered, the voices clawing at the edges of her sanity. It was too much, the monster, the light, the voices. It all melded into a nightmare from which there was no waking. Suddenly, the lifeboat jolted violently, throwing several crew members off their seats. A large, dark shape had collided with them, its body covered in slick, black scales that glistened in the dim light penetrating the fog. "Something's in the water with us," screamed a crew member, terror etching every syllable. The shape circled the lifeboat, its movements causing the water to ripple dangerously. It was massive, easily as large as the boat itself, and it moved with a purpose, its body occasionally breaching the surface in a display of power and menace. "We can't let it tip us over," Tom yelled, trying to steer the boat away from the creature. But the fog was disorienting, making it impossible to determine which way was safe. The creature struck again, this time with more force. The lifeboat rocked perilously, water spilling over the sides. The crew clung to whatever they could, their faces pale with the realization that they might not survive this encounter. Just as all seemed lost, the light flared up again, piercing through the fog with an intensity that was almost divine. The creature paused, its body tensed, and then, with a sound that was a mix of a hiss and a roar, it dove back into the depths, leaving swirling water in its wake. "He's retreating," shouted Alex, relief washing over him. But the relief was short-lived. As the light continued to cut through the fog, more shapes emerged from the depths, drawn to the light or perhaps angered by it. They varied in size and form, some with elongated bodies, others wide and flat, all converging on the lifeboat. "We need to get out of this fog," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "The light is both a beacon and a target." Captain Tom nodded, his eyes scanning the opaque white that surrounded them. "Row towards the light. It's the only landmark we have." Their crew resumed paddling, their movements synchronized, every stroke a defiance against the sea that sought to claim them. The fog swirled around them, alive with whispers and the sounds of unseen creatures moving just beneath the surface. As they moved, the light seemed to grow brighter, or perhaps they were finally nearing its source. Eliza dared to hope that salvation was within reach, but in the depths of her heart, she knew the ocean had not finished with them yet. The nightmare continued, each moment a battle for survival against forces both unknown and terrifying. As they rowed towards the light, the creatures in the water became more aggressive, their shapes more grotesque and varied. Some resembled the ancient leviathans of deep-sea lore, while others defied any description found in the natural world, their forms shifting and pulsating as if made of the sea itself. The light now appeared to be emanating from something tangible, a structure floating on the ocean surface, unlike any vessel or platform known to man. It was massive, with towering sides and illuminated ports that cast a harsh, unnatural glow across the waves. The structure's design was angular and severe, giving it an almost otherworldly appearance. As they drew closer, a sense of dread filled the crew. The structure's presence on this remote part of the ocean was as inexplicable as the light that had seemingly protected them. But as they approached, the attacks from the deep grew fewer and less intense, as if the creatures themselves feared what lay ahead. "Stay alert," Captain Tom commanded, his voice carrying a mix of resolve and unease. "We don't know what we're dealing with here." The lifeboat finally reached the base of the structure. A ladder hung down the side, swaying gently in the wind, its lower rungs just touching the water. The sea around them was strangely calm here, the malevolent entities of the deep seemingly reluctant to follow into the light's full intensity. "Should we board?" Alex asked, his voice tinged with hesitation. "We have no choice," Eliza responded, her eyes fixed on the ladder. "It's this or the sea." One by one, they climbed, their bodies weary but driven by the desperate hope of refuge. As they ascended, the light enveloped them completely, blinding them momentarily as they transitioned from the dark embrace of the ocean to the stark, illuminated reality of the structure. Upon reaching the top, they found themselves on a platform, facing a series of sealed doors. Each door was marked with symbols that were neither letters nor numbers, but something altogether different, glyphs that pulsed slightly with a luminescent glow. The platform was deserted, or so it seemed. The air was still, heavy with the scent of ozone and salt. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sounds of the storm they had left behind and the soft hum of the structure itself. Suddenly, one of the doors opened with a hiss, revealing a darkened corridor beyond. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the light from within. It was a man, or at least, it appeared to be. He was tall, his features obscured by the brightness behind him. "Welcome," the figure spoke, his voice echoing slightly off the metal walls. "We've been expecting you." "Who are you?" Captain Tom demanded, his hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm he no longer carried. The figure stepped forward, coming into clearer view. His features were sharp, almost too perfect, with an ageless quality. His eyes, unnaturally bright, seemed to look right through them. "We are the caretakers," he replied, his tone neutral. "This is a sanctuary of sorts, but also much more. You are safe here from the ocean's wrath." "And the creatures?" Eliza asked, her voice steady despite the surreal situation. "They are part of the ocean's defense," the man explained, gesturing for them to follow him inside. "Ancient protectors of a secret that has been kept for millennia." As they walked through the corridor, the lights flickered, casting strange shadows along the walls. The air grew colder, and a subtle vibration could be felt underfoot, as if the entire structure were alive. What secret? Alex couldn't help but ask, his curiosity piqued despite the fear. The man stopped and turned to face them, his expression solemn. This structure is not just a sanctuary, it is a gateway, he revealed, his eyes reflecting a depth of knowledge and sadness. A gateway to what lies beneath the deepest part of the ocean. What you call the Mariana Trench is but a surface scratch. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Eliza felt a chill run down her spine as the implications of his words began to sink in. They were standing on the brink of a discovery that could change everything they knew about the Earth, and perhaps about their own existence. As they reached the end of the corridor, the man opened another door, leading them into a vast chamber. The room was filled with screens and equipment, much more advanced than anything aboard the Kronos star. At the center, a large, circular window looked out into the deep blue, where lights illuminated part of the trench below. Here, the man said, gesturing towards the window. You will see for yourself soon. The crew gathered around, their eyes wide in anticipation. As they stared into the depths, a light began to emerge from the abyss.